All right, welcome everybody. We'll get started. So on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's program with Professor Jeffrey Kopstein of University of California, Irvine. He will speak on his research, Prelude to the Holocaust, Anti-Jewish Pogroms of the Summer of 1941. This talk was made possible by the 1939 Society Program in Holocaust Studies. We hope you can join us in many more Levy Center events this year. You will find more information on upcoming events at the table near the entrance of the room. I want to thank the Levy Center staff, who's always fantastic, Chelsea, who can't seem to find, for making the arrangements for today's event. And I'd like you all to take a moment and please silence your phones before we begin. So very briefly, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Jeffrey Kopstein is the Dean's Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. Over the past 3 decades, Professor Kopstein's work has focused on issues of interethnic violence, voting patterns of minority groups, anti-Semitism, and anti-liberal tendencies in civil society. He's the author of several books on these topics: Intimate Violence, on the Pogroms, which we'll see today, editor of Politics, Memory, and Violence, The New Social Science of the Holocaust, and most recently, The Assault on the State, How the Global Attack on Modern Government Endangers Our Future, which was named by Foreign Affairs as one of the best books of 2025. Now, those familiar with his work will know that it always bears a special depth and complexity, always methodologically creative and rigorous in terms of its engagement with sources. Even from those book titles, you would know that Professor Kopstein is also comfortable crossing borders, languages, and time periods with ease. And he is also just at ease talking about taking apart voting records from the Second Polish Republic in the 1920s, as he would be from Georgia voting records in the 2010s. By the themes I've just listed, you can guess that his work is also increasingly relevant, seemingly with each passing day. And I think, as scholars of political violence like to say, it is never a good time to be very relevant. Having scholars capable of comparative work on the rise of illiberalism in a thoughtful and informed manner, not just premised on fads or caprice, is needed now more than ever. And I'd encourage everyone here to read any of his articles in the popular press on these very important and pressing topics. For the talk today, Professor Kopstein will focus on a brutal wave of violence that targeted Jews in hundreds of predominantly Polish and Ukrainian communities in the aftermath of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. And this is the focus of the book that you see on the screen, and the one I'm holding here. Some 80 years after these events, the root causes of these pogroms are still hotly debated. While many claim that revenge for the 21-month Soviet occupation that preceded the Nazi one was the sole factor for this violence, Kopstein and his co-author reframe much of this discussion by posing a critical question, and one that had been really seriously underserved, I think, in the literature on this issue. Why did the pogroms occur in some places and not others? This deceptively short, a mere only 150 pages, book that packs a breathtaking amount of research and thought seeks to answer this question, and this is what we're going to hear about today. And I'll finish with just one last aside. And so while I find it brave for anyone to wade into the murky waters of the summer of 1941, which is seemingly still taking its casualties, it is also similarly brave to enter into a field as a political scientist that is dominated by historians. To put it politely, historians as a bunch, not necessarily known for their love of political science approaches to historical issues, but in this book, in addition to its rigorous analysis, it really occupies a special space in how it is both invited in and pushed historians to think in a cross-disciplinary way. And I think that's one of the really special aspects of this work. And it's, I think converted or taught a number of historians a lot of things, but certainly not all of them, as you can see from some of the reviews. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Professor Kopstein.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jared, for inviting me here today. International Holocaust Remembrance Day, I don't think we should forget. I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. It was especially great to come here a little early and talk to Jared at lunchtime, because you don't get to talk to that many people who are actually interested in exactly what you're doing. And usually in academia it's 3 or 4 people, and so I've talked to one of them today, and he's doing really interesting kind of detailed but also broad work. So I'm going to talk about this book that and things that have happened since I published this book with Jason Wittenberg already 6 years ago. And my father, who's 92, he always says the important thing to tell them is not that they read the book, but that they buy the book. So I'm going to be talking about this book, Intimate Violence. And as Jared said, I'm a political scientist. I'm going to approach this as a social scientist, and you'll see in a few minutes, and I don't want you to get nervous. I'm going to show you a little math, but not that much, and you won't get sweaty palms, I promise. But I want to tell you about what we're studying first. It's a set of pogroms that occurred as soon as the Germans invade what was Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe. Right? They occurred in Lithuania. They occurred in Eastern Poland, or what is sometimes called Western Belarus and Western Ukraine. They occurred in Romania, in Bukovina. And we know a lot about these pogroms now, but not as much as we think we know. And since I've written this book, things have happened that, and was one of the things that Jared and I talked about at lunch, you learn new things and you change your views, right? And that's okay, as that's what science is about. As we said, when I encounter new information, I change my views. What do you do? This is what we should be doing. So this entire thing I'm going to be talking about today is a set of pogroms, that is neighbor-on-neighbor violence, that occurred in the first month of World War II. And that makes the project sort of tractable, and there are things you can do with it because you're slicing off a chunk. After that month, the Germans come back and basically kill everybody. Now, there are survivors, and that's how we know about what happened. And we know also from the German records. So Operation Barbarossa. The Germans roll through very quickly, trying to decapitate the Soviet leadership, make their way to Moscow as fast as possible. In their wake, in about 10% of places, that is, according to our count, 219 out of 2,304 localities in just eastern Poland. If you add in Romania and Lithuania, it probably adds up to about 300 out of 3,000 places. The locals turn violently against their Jewish neighbors. They loot their property, they beat them, they rape them, and they sometimes murder them in the most brutal possible fashion. With garden implements, with clubs. And this also occurred, of course, in Romania and Lithuania. I have a few photos. And it's important to show you these because it's one of the reasons we know about this. This is a famous one. It's actually, there are videos you can see on YouTube if you want. Put in Lvov or Lviv or Lviv or Lemberg pogrom from June 1930 and July 1st, 1941. And you can see here that there was sexual violence involved in these pogroms. Iași pogrom, Romania, June 28th, 1941. One of the most famous incidents, of course, is the Kaunas or Kovno garage massacre of June 27th, 1941. That's 5 days after the beginning of the war, where a man with a pipe wrench beats to death between 45 and 50 Jews, while onlookers are looking, and you can't see well. There are other angles from this incident where there are lots of civilians looking, children, local children looking on. When that guy finishes, he takes an accordion and plays the national anthem. And so this is a sort of festival of violence, right? In the Bakhtinian sense, those of you are literary people, right? This is kind of and sometimes it ended with church bells ringing. The priests were sometimes, though not always, present. So, as Jared said, this only, and as the data shows, this only happens in about 10% of places, though that's a lot of places. And the question we basically ask is a super simple one. Why do pogroms occur in some locations and not in others? And so we ask, what kinds of places were these? Did they have a common characteristic that differentiated them from others? Right? This is a kind of a basic social scientific question. We use it for everything, right? And we were sort of surprised this hadn't gotten done for the Holocaust. How do we know about this? Well, before I get there, one of the reasons we know about this is the Germans were keen to take those pictures. Those pictures were mostly taken by German army photographers because they wanted to show that the locals also didn't like the Jews. And that this was a sort of a spontaneous event. But we know about it from other sources. We know about it from archives. The Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, right after World War II, recorded about 7,000 testimonies. These are very good testimonies. In fact, I think they're the best of all the testimonies. Why? Because people didn't know yet what to say. Nobody had seen Schindler's List. Nobody used the word Holocaust. Nobody knew if there were any children alive. This was immediately afterwards, and they were done in a very professional manner. And so what I did is I went through, they have little finding aids, and every time pogrom was mentioned, I, or my research assistants, I said, get me that testimony. And they're about 10 pages long each, and they're narrated. There are the German mobile killing units, called the Einsatzgruppen, right? There were 4 of these groups, several hundred trained killers in each, kind of ideological warriors for the Nazi Party. They were deployed from the north all the way to the south of Europe, along this extensive line between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, and they invaded along. We have their reports too, and they're all published. The NKVD, after the war, had these what were called extraordinary commissions, where they came in, this is the Soviet secret police, came in and said, and they captured people, and they said, what did you do? And you can see, the interrogation starts at 7 a.m. and it ends at 1 a.m. the next morning. Those kinds of reports, which you have to use with a bit of caution. Yad Vashem has sometimes repeats of the Jewish Historical Institute reports. The same person gives the testimony twice in 2 different places, slightly inflected from where they give it. I was always a Zionist. I was always a good communist. That's also problematic with the reports. You have to use these all with a bit of caution. And what we did, we simply coded as a binary. Did this place have a pogrom or not? If it had a pogrom, it got a 1. If it didn't have a pogrom, it got a 0. Those are statistics. It's binary, right? Now, of course, that goes over a lot of stuff, and it's one of the things we've learned since writing the book. The pogroms are worse in some places than others, right? Now, we know this from the literature on storming the Bastille, right? That, there's storming the Bastille, and then there's an attack in a local village in France. Are those coded the same way, right? So you'll see, and we can talk about the results and question the results. But in any case, a pogrom cannot be, in our coding, that the Germans just come in and kill everybody. It has to involve significant civilian, where the civilians carry out the violence. If the Germans just come and kill everybody, they did this. That's sometimes called the Holocaust by bullets. They would take people out and dig ditches, and the Holocaust by bullets takes place after these events. Right? That's when the Germans come back. Or if they were held up, if they moved slowly, the German units had time to kill everybody. That happens in central Ukraine. Okay, so we've defined pogrom, although we can come back to this in the Q&A, as involving neighbor-on-neighbor violence. So here's a map of where they were. But before I talk about that map, I want to give you a feel for the kind of what happened. I want to talk about one town. It's the second there. It's Szczecin in northeastern Poland, near the Lithuanian border, on June 27th, 5 days after the war starts, 1941. It is a letter written by a woman named Chaya Soika Golden. Right? She survived the war, and she writes to relatives after the war. And I want to read you a bit of her letter. I'm going to read you half of it. Don't let me forget to come back to the second half at the end of my talk. Here's what happens. The Germans, they hung up their swastika flag and pushed on further. The city lay in chaos. Authority passed to the hands of the Poles. This lasted about 2 weeks. All kinds of rowdies were let out of prison. Dąbrowski, Jakubczyk, the well-known Polish arrestees under the Bolsheviks, Światlowski, chief of the guards, and Yankelitis, the director of the school, and others. They were full of rancor for the Bolsheviks and the Jews. Friday night, the entire city slept quietly. The slaughter began. The Poles had organized it very well. One gang in the news section, a second in the marketplace, a third in Lumscher Street. There in the news section, they murdered Romowski's family, the tailor, Esther Krieger, your neighbor and youngest daughter, Sora, Belech, Anikel, Pishka, Yashinsky, Meisler, the head of the yeshiva, all in their own houses, and many more. They had killed Rosenthal's children in the marketplace. They also killed Heichke with her 6-year-old child at breast, and her older boy, Grecian. Later, the squads divided up the possessions of their victims among themselves. On the readied wagons, they loaded the corpses and led them outside of the town. The Goyim immediately washed the bloodied floors, including the stones in the streets. A few hundred sacrifices had taken place, and still the murderers informed us the massacres would continue for another 2 nights. So the elements were all there: the Soviet occupation, the collapse of the authority, the riot agitators, the hatred, the fear, the rage of the nationalist crowd, the thirst for revenge, blood, booty, and ultimately this sort of intimate violence where the victims knew their perpetrators either by name or by social function. This was not the Holocaust as it's normally studied from 30,000 feet, if you were, the Eichmann as the faceless desk murderer pulling the lever. These are people who knew each other. So here's a map of where it happened. These in the eastern provinces, the eastern voivodeships of Poland. So the data that we have, and we have quite good data, as you'll see, Białystok, Policy, Volhynia, Tarnopol, Stanislavov, and Lvov. Again, I'm playing fast and loose with English and Polish names here. We can switch. All of these names have English, Polish, Yiddish, Russian, Ukrainian names, but I'm just going to use ones that you will know. So why did this happen? Well, in the first place, these areas had all been occupied by the Soviet Union after 1939. No significant amount of pogroms happened east of this. And in the west of this, that is in central Poland that had been, and western Poland that had been occupied by the Germans, pogroms also didn't happen. It's not like you had zero, but you didn't have any of the kind that I'm talking about here. So the normal explanation here is the Germans. No Germans, no Holocaust, no pogroms, right? And I don't have a problem with that at some level, but there are some problems. So the main culprit here is usually pointing to Reinhard Heydrich, who was the kind of, basically the number 3 guy in terms of the Holocaust. If you go Hitler, Himmler, and then Heydrich. Right? And he issues an order to the Einsatzgruppen on June 29th. This is important, the date here. It's 5 days after the beginning of the war. It's 2 days after the Szczecin pogrom. Here's the order. Nothing is to be put in the way of the self-cleansing actions of the anti-communist and anti-Jewish circles in the newly occupied areas. On the contrary, without a trace, they're to be unleashed and, when necessary, intensified. Okay, that's the unquote. That is to say, there is no doubt the Germans wanted locals to do these pogroms. Absolutely. 100%. Why? That we don't really know, to be honest. The most obvious answer is they wanted the locals to do their dirty work for them. But they also clearly wanted to implicate. I mean, did they actually believe that the locals would kill all the Jews? That's hard to do, by the way. We also know a couple of things about this. The Germans were everywhere. The Einsatzgruppen were everywhere. And the pogroms only happened in 10% of places. Why? We also know that in the Einsatzgruppen reports, the Germans complained that they couldn't get the locals to do the pogroms. I mean, it's one thing, it doesn't mean they love Jews. But even if you hate Jews, even if you hate somebody, it doesn't mean you're going to kill them. So it gets tricky. The Germans may have been a necessary condition, but in the terms of social science, they cannot be a necessary but sufficient condition. Now, I'm getting old. I can't remember necessary and sufficient. It cannot be a sufficient condition. What about the Soviet occupation? Before the Germans arrived, this area had been occupied by the Soviet Union. This is like a map that I just chose. I'm not sure it's the best one, but it shows you how Poland had been chopped up by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Hitler-Stalin Pact of September 23rd, 1939. And the area that you had pogroms was all in these eastern areas right at the border. Why? Another explanation, then, is the Soviet occupation was so bad, so dehumanizing. And the people there, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Romanians, and even the Ukrainians had not gotten their own nations. And the Poles and the Lithuanians, of course, had lost their own independence. It gets worse. Just before the Germans invade, the Soviets are about to leave. Before they leave, they have secret police prisons in many of these towns in Poland and especially in Ukraine. In those secret police prisons are Ukrainian and Polish nationalists, the ones who Hayasaka Golding talks about who just got out. Just before they leave, they had been deporting many of these people to Siberia. Those are the lucky ones. They survived the war. But just before they leave, the NKVD, that is the KGB, what we call today, they massacre everybody in those prisons. And the Germans arrive and they find these prisons stuffed full of corpses. And they turn around and they say to the locals, do you see what the Jews have done to your people? And there is evidence that where these prisons were found, the pogroms were worse. There's no doubt about that. It enraged people. But there's a problem. The problem is there's no evidence that Soviet power was any more dehumanizing or worse on the whole than where pogroms happened than where they didn't. The Soviets were everywhere. They were everywhere. You had Soviet power everywhere, but it's the same problem with the Germans. You only have 10% of locations. And in fact, the map of KGB prisons, of NKVD prisons, and the map of pogroms does not match very well. Which leaves us, again, it appears to be a necessary condition. People were pissed off, but not a sufficient condition. Which left us with sort of a puzzle. So explanations that may work and may not work. Leave that open. One is anti-Semitism, right? We're all experts on anti-Semitism now, right? Everybody's an expert on this subject. And another, of course, is avarice. That is greed. There's lots of evidence, and that was in the narrative that I read you. The locals wanted Jewish stuff. They fought over silverware, paintings, clothing, shoes, apartments. But how much did this actually matter? And was anti-Semitism worse in places that had pogroms than places that didn't have pogroms? You would expect that. Of course, anti-Semitism, I'm going to give you two anti-Semites, right? And here are two of the most famous ones, right? Jared, who knows way more about the first one, Stepan Bandera, one of the founding members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, founded in 1929 in Vienna, I believe, but trained, fed, watered by the German military intelligence, and basically told, you're going to invade with us, and you're going to get your own country. You just have to do this one thing first. Right? I'm making a very long story short. And Bandera was deeply involved in this. The other one is, and Bandera was the son of a Catholic priest from impeccable Ukrainian nationalist background. Interestingly, he survives the war, Bandera, and he's assassinated in 1959, I believe, in Munich by a KGB assassin. The other one doesn't survive the war. He's already much older, a guy named Roman Dmowski, who's a Polish nationalist. Dmowski viewed himself as a Polish liberal, but in the sense that Polish liberal, a national Democrat. That is to say, he viewed himself as urban, as rational, not as a crazy anti-Semite, but as a rational anti-Semite. The Jews stood in the way of Polish domination. And there was nothing that anybody could do about that. There was simply, the Jews were unassimilable in his mind. And he had a party called the National Democrats, who were the most popular party in Poland in the interwar period. We don't have to get into this, but actually very interesting later on, who was deeply influenced by the National Democrats in Poland was the Likud, was Jabotinsky in Israel, right? They were influenced by the ideas, right? Not by the practices, of course. And Dmowski did not view himself as a violent person. He said, look, the Jews should be encouraged to leave and to be sort of iced, I can't even use that word, iced out of Polish national and economic life. The business belongs in Polish hands. The state belongs in Polish hands. Poland for the Poles. Okay. I wanted to introduce you to a different character, because I'm telling you a little bit about Polish politics. You might not know who this guy is. He is the most popular Jewish politician in the world, a guy named Yitzhak Grunbaum. He is head of the General Zionists, the largest of the 4 or 5 Zionist parties in interwar Poland. He was very aggressive on behalf of Jewish rights. He was a Zionist. Now, what did Zionism actually mean at this time? Did it mean you were leaving for Eretz Yisrael? The answer is mostly not. They were yearning for Israel, there's no doubt. But for the most part, Zionists in interwar Poland, nobody spoke Hebrew. Some spoke Yiddish. Many spoke Polish. Some spoke both Polish and Yiddish. Their press was in Polish. He was besides yearning for Palestine, if you will, besides yearning for Eretz Yisrael, what they wanted more than anything else was the recognition of Jewish national rights in Poland. That is, the right to work on Sundays, because otherwise they'd have to take 2 days off. The right to have schooling in their national languages, Hebrew or mostly Yiddish at this time. And of course, communal rights as promised in the Minorities Treaty after World War I, a promise that the Poles never adhered to. And, this might surprise you, he wanted to be included in a Polish government. He wanted to have a cabinet position. It was a large party. He easily could have been. Poland was only 2/3 Polish. The largest group were the Ukrainians. The second largest was the Jews, over 3 million Jews. There's a lot of Jews at that time. Then you also had Belarusians, Germans in the west, you had some Lithuanians in the north. He wanted to be a member of the government, but he nor any other minority ever held a cabinet position in interwar Poland. Nobody. They were completely frozen out. He was seen to be aggressive. He was seen by the dominant Poles to be slightly traitorous, because he was signaling to everybody, whatever your nation building project, that's fine. You can be Poles or you can be Ukrainians. We're not joining it. I mean, we can be citizens, good citizens, but we are as Jews. They were full-chested, aggressive Jews. Right? I'm not going to come back to him much more. I want to say what happens to him. He ends up leaving Poland in 1935. He goes to Palestine. He becomes Israel's first minister of the interior in 1948. His son goes to Auschwitz, survives Auschwitz as a capo, goes to France after World War II, and then goes to Israel and dies in the War of Independence. There has never been, I think, a full-on biography of Grunbaum. There certainly deserves to be, because he's an interesting guy. He was apparently not a pleasant guy. Every Polish document that I've ever said what a terrible person he is, but that's fine. I mean, politicians aren't necessarily pleasant, as we're finding out. The last character I want to give you is one more character from Polish politics. Józef Pilsudski. Pilsudski was a general, as you can see. He was a marshal, in fact. He would be above general. He viewed himself initially as a social democrat, but he was a war hero when Poland is founded. He beats back the Russians. And in 1926, that is 4 years after the founding of Poland, he and his supporters conduct a coup d'etat. They take over power. But he's not a complete dictator. And above all, he's not an anti-Semite. He had very good relations with the Jewish community. He viewed Poland as, he wanted to have a big multinational Poland where the Poles would be the big brothers. To vote for Pilsudski, to support Pilsudski, and Pilsudski, most importantly, holds a pretty free and fair election 2 years after he takes power in 1928. So he's not quite a Putin, right? He is a tolerant authoritarian. Okay, so I'm giving you, I've given you the dramatis personae, right? Now I want to talk about this. What are the problems with studying pogroms? Well, there are a bunch of them. One is, most people say there were pogroms in Ukraine. There were pogroms in Poland. Well, okay, where? Like everywhere? Every square inch of the territory? Clearly, I've already told you that's not true. Another, and here I'm going to, with due respect to the historians, you have unsystematic examples. That is to say, you have people who know everything about one pogrom, or two pogroms, or three pogroms. And one wants to know, is this representative? After all, the pogrom that inspired this study, it inspired both Jared and I, was documented by a historian, sociologist actually, named Jan Gross, who studied a town called Jedwabne, where is one of the pogroms in my study. Actually, the origins of this book are quite simple. It's that he documented one town where, in his words, half the town killed the other half the town. They put them in a barn and burned them. And then he says in one footnote, it happened in other places. And I write Jan, and I say, which other places, Jan? He says, you might want to start here. And of course, 10 years later, there's a book. Okay. There's another problem. Mostly pogroms involve historically, what happens with the state? Does the state side with one group or the other? We know this from lynching in the American South. Was the Americans where the state was clearly on the side of white people? What's good about our study, methodologically speaking, is there was no state. The state had disappeared. The Soviets had gone. The Germans weren't really yet in control. We can actually look at actual social relations between people. So did we get around the unsystematic samples by actually studying everyone we could find? There's probably more. That is, if every Jew who was killed in the place during the pogrom, we wouldn't know a pogrom had happened there. Okay. So what theory do we adopt? This is the one I want to show you today. That is to say, from the study of the United States, that first point is taken from the study of race relations in the United States. Dominant groups, when they perceive a threat of minority demographics and the popularity of their parties, or parties advocating racial and ethnic equality, the dominant group responds by repressing the minority. So our argument here is this gave a perfect opportunity for this to happen. In Poland, non-Jews commit pogroms in response to Jewish demands for national equality. That's all that Grunbaum wanted. There was no Israel. There was no place to go. You couldn't get there. And we maintain this alienated non-Jews and inflamed Polish and Ukrainian nationalists. And so the likelihood for a pogrom should increase. It should increase in those places that have a larger Jewish population, a greater proportion of Jews, places where towns, little villages, where the Jewish support for the Zionists or the Bundists, right, other nationalist parties are strong, and where you have greater support for Pilsudski, the government party, who was tolerant. That is, that would really piss off the Polish nationalists or Ukrainian nationalists. Okay. So that's the basic, stated in terms of social science, that's what we expect to find. How do we find that out? Okay, so we collect this data. I'm going to go over that material again just to make sure everybody's caught up. Though you'll be tested at the end. After June 22nd, 1941, you have this eastern Poland areas, eastern Polish areas. You have the state collapse after the German invasion. You have civil society collapse. You have moral and ethical collapse. But we can observe the propensity to commit pogroms under those conditions. It's sort of a laboratory. And there we have those numbers again, 219 out of 2,304 places where Jews lived. Of course, if there were no Jews in a place, you couldn't have had an anti-Jewish pogrom. So there's places where Jews lived. It's a world that doesn't exist anymore. It is gone. So how do we know this? So we know that pogroms, we talked about where we get it from. We know a lot about what kinds of places these were by looking at the Polish census for every town in the region. We know how many Jews, how many Catholics, how many Belarusians, how many Orthodox, how many Germans. We know it all. We also know we have very good data for every place that we have that census data for. We have good data on elections. Who voted for which parties? In two elections, in 1922 and 1928. After 1928, there are really no free and fair elections. And you can say in advance, this is difficult because the pogroms we're talking about happened in 1941. It's a 13-year difference. That's the best we can do. I want to point you again to the types of parties we're looking at here. You have the Polish Nationalist and Anti-Semitic Party, the National Democrats, sometimes called the Endacja, from N and Day, Endacja. You have the Zionist parties, who are sometimes called the Minorities Bloc and sometimes called the Zionists, right? It depends where they are in Poland. They're like Jews. If you have like 5 Jews, you have 6 political parties. They all disagree with each other. They all hate each other's guts, right? In general, the northern Zionists, dominated by Grunbaum, tended to be very hardcore in Polish politics. The Galician Zionists, because they come out of a more Habsburg context, we can talk about this later, tend to be softer core. We also have data on who voted communist. What did it mean to be a communist? It meant basically, it was one of the things where Jews and non-Jews could actually get together. It was unliberal, but it was not racist. It was workers of the world unite, after all. Solidarities would be based on class, not race. And then we have this government party, the BBWR, which is the acronym for, in Polish, the non-party bloc for cooperation with the government. That's Pilsudski's party. Okay. Now I'm going to present you some statistical results. So don't get nervous. I'm going to walk you through them. This is, in the first place, just Jan Gross's town, Jedwabne, compared to all the other towns around him. So the question is the town that Jan Gross found, where half the Jews killed the other half the Jews, was it like the other pogrom locations? Those 31, look at the bottom, N is the number of places, towns. So you have 31 that had pogroms, and then you have Jedwabne. And what this shows you is that Jedwabne is sort of unique in two ways. One, it was much more Jewish. 62% of the population was Jewish. It was more nationalist. Look at the Endecia, 16% compared to 22%. And it was much more Zionist. The minorities bloc, 28% compared to 50%. And according to our calculations, and this involves some math, but it's not actually that hard math. If you look at the very bottom there, the Jewish vote for the minorities bloc in 1928, 76% of Jews voted for the Zionists in 1928. This was a Zionist town. I'm not blaming the Zionists. I'm just telling you, this is evidence for an extreme degree of political polarization. You have Polish nationalists voting 63%, that is Poles voting for their own nationalist parties, and you have Jews voting for their own Zionist parties. This was a deeply divided town. What about places that had pogroms compared to places that didn't have pogroms? I want to show you some results now for that. Okay, so you have several groups of numbers here. Do I have a laser pointer? Is there one? That's all right, if I don't. I'm just going to walk you through it. It's easy. Don't get nervous. You have two columns there. Look at the top. The column on the left had pogroms. The column on the right did not have pogroms. Look at the bottom, the N. That is the number of places. 56 places had pogroms. 296 places did not have pogroms. Okay, so here you have a mixture of places. In the first place, the places that had pogroms were much more Jewish. And that confirms what we found out from Jedwabne. Look at the difference, look at the third row there, the minorities bloc. And then the fourth row, the Jewish support for the minorities bloc. Those are the Zionists. That is, in places that had pogroms, if you look at column 4, row 4, 51% of Jews, the median, 51% of Jews voted for the Zionists. Whereas where you didn't have pogroms, it was much less. Not only that, of course, if you look at one above that, in places where you had pogroms, 22% of the vote went for the Zionists and only 1% where you did not have pogroms. Clearly, again, these are towns where you had pogroms that were much more activated into militant Jewish politics. Now, it is also true, if you look at the black letters there, the vote for Polish nationalists and the Polish support for Polish nationalists, it's also higher there. That is, Polish places that had pogroms, the nationalist party, the Endecia, the anti-Semitic party, was also stronger. So again, we're talking about a story here less of anti-Semitism. And you're going to see in a couple minutes that I'm right. It's less of anti-Semitism than a clash of politics, a clash of nationalist politics, to be sure, but a clear clash of nationalist politics. Then I want to talk about very briefly the result that, well, first of all, this result really surprised us. This was told, because, of course, we went into this thinking it's going to be easy. We're going to show wherever the Polish nationalists were strong, you're going to get pogroms, and whenever they're weak, you're not going to get pogroms. And that's not what we found. In fact, that difference between 39 and 24 for Polish support for the nationalists, it's actually, when you test it all against each other, it's not statistically significant. Which is to say, it's not that there wasn't anti-Semitism, it's there was too much anti-Semitism. It was everywhere. It can't distinguish between places that had pogroms versus places that did not. The next result that surprised us was we expected places that where communism was strong to have pogroms. It's the exact opposite. That is, places that had pogroms, the communists got 2% of the vote. Places that had no pogroms, you had a 6 times stronger communist presence. You had a proportional representation system, which is a lot like Israel's, by the way. Those of you who know about Israel, where do you think the Israelis got the idea from? Right? It's the same electoral system, I should add. Right? In a proportional representation system, to get 12% of the vote is pretty good. And so communism appears to provide an immunizing effect against pogroms. Something we didn't totally expect, but I told Jared about this earlier, and in Volhynia it's even stronger. It's much stronger, in fact. Communist places were much, I don't have the slide here, but it's in the book. Okay, so here are these weird results. Now, this is not a statistics crowd, I can tell you just by looking out there. This just tells you I'm right. It not only tells you I'm right, if you look at this one here, this tests all the variables against each other, kind of a tournament. And when you test them all, when you account for all of them against each other, the only thing that appears to matter is the vote for the Zionists. Even the vote for the nationalists doesn't really matter. Okay. So let's look at the Ukrainian areas. In the Ukrainian areas, you basically have the same story. It's the same story, despite it being a completely different place. That is, places where you had a high percentage of Jews were much more likely to have a pogrom. Places where the Jewish support for the Zionists, you were much more likely to have a pogrom. Look at their J support for Zionists. It's twice as high in the pogrom areas. And then you do have a slightly higher chance of a pogrom in those places where the government party, the tolerant party, was slightly stronger. But again, it tells you the same story. And the graph, it's remarkable. Everybody, all of Polish studies argues that the legacy of the Habsburgs versus the Russians is decisive. This tells you that's not true. This tells you that you basically have the same results, even with these much softer core Zionists. That is, when you see this one, this is basically a regression, a statistical regression, and this just tells you, I'm not going to go into this in detail, this just tells you I'm right. Yeah. So, I'm going to talk about just for a few minutes before I finish. I have a couple minutes, right? How are we doing? Okay.
You're going to read the second half of the...
I am definitely going to read the second half of that. Let me start there first. So we ended up with the Germans saying it's going to go on for 2 more days. The Poles said. This is again from Chaya Soika Golding. The remaining women were stricken with fear. What do we do? How can we save ourselves? My mother ran to the priest to beg for the Jews. They offered no help. With Hanna, Liba, Zemel, and Salen, I ran to the Polish intelligentsia, which usually means veterinarians and lawyers and school teachers. There too we found no salvation. My mother with other women ran after help in a nearby town, Grajeva. They were not let into the town. Curfew. What do we do? Night was falling upon us. Approximately 20 Germans entered the city, a field troop. We were afraid to show ourselves before them. Then I had an idea. To try our luck with the soldiers, maybe they would help us. With great difficulty, we chose a delegation and departed. The group of Germans consisted of soldiers and 2 officers. In the beginning, they declined to help us. This isn't our business. We're fighting at the front, not with civilians, they explained. However, when I offered them soap and coffee, they softened up. They guarded the city at night, and all remained quiet. I, with 2 other women, began to work for them, and later we were placed to work in the German headquarters. And so, in this manner, the pogroms in Szczecin were stopped for a while. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to mention about this. This was the 5th day of the war. The Germans had soap and coffee. They didn't need soap and coffee. Of course, I'm a guy, and I read this many, many, many times. And it took me a couple years to figure out that this was not soap and coffee. Right? And in fact, there's other testimonies that talk about how the most beautiful flower of the Jewish community went to work for the Germans. Right? So, I mean, I think the allusion to sex slavery it's not that surprising. It's even not that all unusual, but it's clearly, in this case, what happened. So let me focus there on things that there's been criticisms, as Jared mentioned, and things I've learned, right? Just for a minute. I learned a lot about what the meaning and function were of interwar Zionism. Right? When it may have been yearning for Palestine, no doubt. And if there had only been an Israel, the Jews could have left. It would have saved everybody. But you couldn't go to Israel. And for the most part, the interwar Zionists were simply full-chested, aggressive Jewish politicians, promoting Jewish communal interests. As what else should they be doing? The Jews had just as much a right to their nation-building project as anyone else. I'm not blaming the Zionists for the pogroms. One critic accused me of that, us of that. No, right? To point to some feature of a target community, such as community size or political preference, and how that interacted with the majority community, is in no way to blame the victims for their own violence. It's simply good social science. The role and function of communism. I fully expected communism to be associated with greater violence. In fact, it wasn't. The nature of the kind of account that we're presenting here. We sort of show that anti-Semitism, it may have been a necessary condition, but it wasn't sufficient. It was everywhere. It was everywhere. It wasn't that there was too little anti-Semitism. There was too much anti-Semitism. It was everywhere. Lots of places had a lot of anti-Semitism and no pogroms. And lots of places had very little anti-Semitism and did have pogroms. When you look at the motives for the violence, the research on this is mostly drawn from these testimonies. But these testimonies, they're contradictory. They sense betrayal. We got along so well with the local Polish population. Why did they do that? And then when they asked again, they said, because they hated us. But those two things don't make sense. You can't say both of those things. Well, of course you can. They do. Anti-Semitism. Greed. Lots of testimonies talk about greed. And I have data on that too, which I didn't present. Anti-Semitism, avarice, revenge for the communist experience, plain sexual depravity, or depravity of various sorts. That's all present. If you look at the individuals, what you find is a huge mixture, a giant mess of human subjectivity, which is real. The kind of explanation we're offering here is what kinds of communities could allow that subjectivity to be acted upon or not. Because sometimes it takes a village in that sense too. Finally, I want to bring up an issue of comparison. There's a lot of discussion in Holocaust studies. I sit on the Academic Council of the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C. A lot of discussion of comparison. What, is it appropriate? Is it not appropriate? Is it a vehicle of anti-Semitism? All fair questions. I'm one of those people who favors comparison. It's the only way of making the Holocaust relevant. You compare not only to say something's the same, but to show how it's different. That, in fact, comparison may highlight the Holocaust's uniqueness. In fact, the Germans were hunting the world for Jews. They collected lists of the American Jewish community. Remarkable. So we compare. I think this moral question of comparison has really hindered science, and I think it's important that we do compare. There's one other point about this with comparison that I wanted to raise here before I conclude. What we've done here in this study is we've said, yes, the Holocaust is this one big thing, this global catastrophe, right, that's spread across the world, certainly across the Eurasian landmass, massacring Jews, killing Jews. But seen a different way, the Holocaust was a series of small events. In the era that I'm talking about here, the summer of 1941, nobody knew there would be a Holocaust. Nobody knew. The Wannsee Conference had yet to happen. The concentration camps hadn't opened up. The death camps hadn't opened up yet. So the idea that the locals were using this as an opportunity to get even with their future political rivals, it makes no sense to us, but that's only because we knew what happened next. We're like watching a monster movie saying, stop! But that's only because we know what happened next. The locals did not know what would happen next. So seen that way, the Holocaust is a series of smaller events that aggregated together becomes one big event. But once you separate it off the way we do, you can then compare with other places. These pogroms are comparable. They're comparable with lynching in the American South, where in fact, breakdown by demography and party preference has been a favored tool of sociologists for a very long time. Just read the book called The Festival of Violence by Tolnay and Beck. It can be used to study Hindu-Muslim violence in India and usefully compare the conditions under which these kinds of things occur. And of course, it can be used to study other instances of anti-Jewish violence across time and space, from the world's first pogrom in Alexandria in 38 CE, documented by Philo, through the pogroms of 1391 in Spain, to, of course, the pogroms after 1880 and the Holocaust itself. There is nothing wrong with doing all of that. It's just that you have to use a bit of seichel. You have to think about it a bit, what exactly you're doing, what you're trying to prove. So with that, I appreciate all of your attention. You focused a little bit, and that's good. And I'm happy to take questions, comments, or criticisms. Jared.
Book in our field. So I'll just start with, and we'll open up to everyone else, just a couple quick, maybe two quick questions for you to kick us off. The first, and this is something I've been thinking about much more recently in this question of comparison, just to pick up where you left off. We have this window of time, these 2 weeks, and this is not relevant for all the areas that you've looked at in your study. We have this 2 weeks in 39, right, after the Nazis have invaded, but before the Soviets show up, right? And these same, one of the documentary bases that you use, the Żydowski Institute testimonies, mention violence or sporadic violence or violence that looks pogrom-like happening during this brief window of time. There's statelessness, there's confusion, there's pent-up anger at what the Poles have done. And of course, when the Poles leave, they're not putting bullets in everyone in the prison. The nationalists are walking out of the prisons. And so that kind of research on those 2 weeks, and we know there is some violence, there are some pogroms. Is that something and I don't even remember this, is that something you've looked at? Did you chart that? How do you think about that as just a comparison that, gets rid of the Soviet factor? The second question, and I swear this is not a historian criticizing voting data, but lovely voting data, but the cultivation of national political, ethnic identities. As we know, that happens on, or can happen on a spectrum that is not all happening at the same time everywhere, especially in a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, confessional region like Volhynia, which I happen to look at. So we have people's kind of ability to identify oneself as a Ukrainian or as a member of a political party or as a member, or as a nationalist. Those are more or less depending on where you are. And the one example, even I think you actually see it on your map in Policia, in northern Volhynia, Policia, right? There's a low national identity there and nationalist identity. So in terms of how that voting data kind of reflects about this ability or self-identity of the people doing the violence, how does that correlate to nationalist aspiration or even national identity? How much of that is needed as well on top of that to explain some of the violence, given that we know there's a lot of nationalist actors? I'll leave it there.
They're both perfectly fair questions. In fact, yes, there was violence when the Germans march in initially into the eastern areas. And in fact, in Szczecin, in the very town that I talked about, it's probably the best way of answering your question, there was some violence because the Germans come in, commit some violence, and then they leave. Right? And some of the men go, it's mostly men at the beginning, right? The men go away. That's why the narrative that I gave you is like these women who are deeply worried because the men they know they're in trouble. And so the Germans do carry out some killings in 1939. It's not mass, and it's not a pogrom. It's not really neighbor-on-neighbor violence in the same way. It's mostly the Germans Germaning at that time, right? No, I'm being too flip. It's mostly the Germans using their military and some police forces to carry out some killing, but it's not a lot. It's very little. And some of those people who go away with the Germans, they come back. They're not killed immediately. Right? So there's that. So I agree with you. These happen. They're not of the same scale, and it's mostly not neighbor-on-neighbor violence. There's some, but not very much. It's pretty minor. There's actually very few killings in the 39 period. Okay, so that's number one. The second one is much dicier, and this is inside baseball stuff a little bit. So here we have the areas, and so what Jared is talking about there, he's talking about area number 3, right? Volhynia in English. That is a very difficult area to study. And we actually even separated, in our Ukraine chapter, we separated it out from the rest. And the reason why, not only is it a huge mixture of Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Jews, right? But as Jared just said, many of the Belarusians and Ukrainians were not exactly sure what they were. Now, what do I mean by that? In this area of Poland, they had a census in 1931. And when they asked people what you were, they gave you an option for saying, I'm from here. It's called tutieshi, right? And tutieshi, that is, I'm a here. Now, everybody knew they were Christian. So how did we actually code who lived there? We used the religion data. Now that's a dicey decision, you may say, right? Because we said anybody who's Orthodox, right? Now the good news is the Orthodox and Ukrainian sort of overlap with each other in that area for the most part. We do miscode a certain number of Belarusians, not that many, right? But we're pretty honest. We're deeply honest about this, right? So the one thing I'll say is that over the course of the interwar period, and especially in the 1930s, in the run up to World War II, that ambiguity of identity, which historians and anthropologists love so much, it sort of goes away. Because you couldn't be ambiguous about this anymore. You had to sort of make some choices. Now, sometimes those choices were deeply instrumental, undoubtedly. But they involve things like schooling, where you're going to send your kids to school. And that has kind of permanent long-term effects. Once you teach your kid Polish, and the Jews were finding this out, of course, too. Once you teach your kid Polish, you increasingly become Polish. One of the grand ironies for the Jews, interestingly enough, if our story is correct, in another 20 or 25 years, Polish Jewry might have looked a lot like American Jewry, in the sense that they would have increasingly spoken Polish. They would have been Jewish, but in the way that a lot of American Jews are Jewish, right? Okay, I had a bar mitzvah, I speak some Hebrew, I have a certain identification, we do the Friday nights, but I'm so American, or I'm Canadian actually, but I'm so tied to this place. And it would have probably been like that. But the pressure of the Polish nationalizing state combined with the Nazis sort of made everybody make a choice, right? And that ambiguity, which I know there's all these historians who love the ambiguity because, it shows that identities are all socially constructed. I agree social identities are constructed. But what I want to say back to that, sometimes they're very well constructed. So well constructed. You didn't have a lot of Jews running around in this area, in the area that you care about, saying, am I Belarusian? That just wasn't happening. That was a pretty well-constructed identity. It had been constructed for a very long time. So that's my short and dirty answer.
Yes, if I understand correctly, thank you so much. Is it true that the areas that had pogroms had a larger percent Jewish population than the areas that didn't have pogroms?
Yes.
Was that significantly larger?
Yeah, and I think it's significant in the following way. I'm glad you asked that.
I meant statistically, but you
Statistically, yes. It depends what you put it beside, right? If you're running a tournament of variables, right? The Zionism trumps. Well, you can't use that word anymore either, I guess. Zionism trumps everything, right? But why does it? And here we have an explanation for that, which I didn't talk about. So let me just mention it for 1 minute. The Jewish parties and the Polish parties and the Polish Social Democratic parties and the communist parties, they weren't stupid, but they had limited resources. Jewish parties tended to invest their resources where? Where there were a lot of Jews, right? What's more, in those places where Jews were a smaller group, they were much more likely to be absorbed into Polish political life. Which parties did the Jews vote for if they didn't vote for the Jewish parties? Answer, we have that. Right? They voted for Pilsudski. They voted for the authoritarian, tolerant guy who wasn't going to have all these crazy party politics. We might recognize that from other contexts as well, too. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, I just one more, but actually the point of my question was, is it possible that the towns that had pogroms, the reason may have been because there was a larger Jewish population, so they saw Jews were in their face,
Right.
they couldn't get out of their minds.
Right.
And then the voting pattern, is it possible that that's incidental?
That's epiphenomenal to the yeah, I understand where you're going with it. Perfectly fair question. You raise the question of visibility. It's true. Any self-respecting pogromist would say, let's go where the Jews are. That's your point, right? And what we're finding is we're sort of backfilling the evidence for that. Where I would disagree, mildly, is on the issue of visibility. Because it just so happens that the Zionist voting Jews were the least visible Jews. The most visible Jews, because I didn't tell you what kind of Jew was voting for Pilsudski. It was largely the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox, right? What was called, the party which sort of disappears in Poland was called Agudat Yisrael, which, by the way, is still called Agudat Yisrael, right? It's an Orthodox. These are the black hat parties, right? They were the ones who were more visible, yet in the pogroms, they were those towns where they dominated were less likely to be targeted. So which does play against your visibility point, though I don't think it's completely wrong because Agudat was everywhere and there was always Orthodox Jews, and especially in Galicia, right, where they were especially strong, the Hasidim were especially strong. In the north, they tended to be more mitnagdim, right, the more what would be the proper English translation of that? Not modern Orthodox, but that's what modern Orthodox becomes. They were non-Hasidic Orthodox Jews. Let's put it that way, okay? And so that's the quick and dirty answer to your question. So this woman here, no? I'm sorry.
Thanks, that was really fascinating, and I learned a lot. And being statistically illiterate, I'm totally convinced by your statistical analysis. Honestly, I am. And so I understand that it's the strength of a particular political orientation of Zionist, i.e. nationalist,
right.
Jewish parties. But I guess what I'm still not quite sure I understand is what does that trigger that triggers the pogroms? Is it like ethnic competition, political conflict? I'm kind of missing that.
Right. So it does a number of things. You put your finger on the ambiguity in the analysis, which is super important. We're not saying. So what do we not find? What do we not find in the documents, in the narratives, in the testimonies? Nobody, hardly anybody, actually, some people do. Hardly anybody in the testimony says, "Let's go kill those Jews. They're Zionists." Nobody says that. That's not the way people talk, by the way, under those kinds of conditions. So that doesn't surprise me. But what did voting Zionist mean? So let me answer your question. It meant you were not joining the Polish or Ukrainian nation-building project, for sure. Right? It sent, what we want to argue, is it sent a crystal clear signal to everybody in the community that that was the intention, to not join that project. Whatever else you were going to do here, to make a Poland for the Poles, to make a Ukraine for the Ukrainians, as the Ukrainian nationalists were quite intent on, the Jews weren't going to join it in that way. They would only join as equal partners, right? As Jews, right? So it's the sending of the signal. That's the nature of the argument. That's the kind of causal argument. Now, the real political scientists, they laugh at this. That's why he said, I cross over into history, but they don't like it either, because you're not supposed to do this, right? But the political scientists, of course, want to have a causal identification. They want to know, how do you know that was actually happening, right? We don't. But I think where our study is at its strongest, is in refuting all the other explanations. It can't be anti-Semitism, it can't be the Soviets, it can't be the Germans, so it must be something else. And what we've offered here is a set of data that you need to then explain. And we've offered what we think is a reasonable explanation, right? That doesn't blame the Jews, yet it says this is largely a story of ethnic competition, which is intensified by Jewish political behavior. It upsets, it angers the local nationalists. Now remember, the local nationalists are also upset at those groups, communists and Pilsudskyites, who also favor accommodation with the Jews. So it's not just Zionists who are pissing off or angering the Polish and Ukrainian nationalists. It's also those who are going for any form of ethnically tolerant politics. Does that get at your question?
Yeah.
So there's a woman here. Let's see. Yeah. Go ahead. Mask. Yes.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating. It's very close to my heart because I'm a perfect person to be interviewed, obviously from my accent.
Ja taki dumał.
So my father was from East Ukraine,
Right.
and my mother was from Bessarabia.
Really?
So you said that Yash was had pogroms because the Soviets invaded that area before the war. They didn't. Yash was always part of Romania.
True.
Right?
True.
Okay.
Um,
So one point.
yes. True.
The other point was that you also mentioned, was controversial, that they hated, the locals hated the communists. And that's not exactly true.
No, I didn't say that, but that's okay.
Okay. In Bessarabia, in 1940, when the Soviets came, they were greeted with flowers,
Sure.
and cakes, and everything else, and the population loved them. Same thing in West Ukraine.
Yes.
Both my parents said that the Soviets, after they occupied those territories, gave them dignity.
Which is my argument. Absolutely. I'm so happy you brought that up. There's actually a wonderful historian named Diana Dumitru, right? Who's from Moldova. And she's written an entire book documenting this. What she shows is in those areas that the Soviets had occupied, right? You did not have pogroms because they drained the anti-Semitism from public life. Right? That's basically her argument.
Literally or figuratively.
Sorry?
Literally.
Yeah, literally sometimes. Exactly. They took away the poison of anti-Semitism. Which makes my argument because I want to say it wasn't the Soviet occupation that caused the pogroms. The Soviet occupation was, in the case of Eastern Poland and Ukraine, it was an aggravating factor. Right? In the case of Western Belarus and Western Ukraine, it was definitely an aggravating factor. There's no doubt about it. And especially the NKVD prisons. There's just too much evidence for that. Right? Clearly, the Romanian case shows, and the Romanians participated quite actively and enthusiastically in the Holocaust, from everywhere, from their own country all the way to Odessa, and deep into Ukraine. So I'm glad you brought up that point.
Want to move from this slide?
Sure.
So, the Soviets invaded Estonia.
Soviets invaded Estonia and Latvia about the same time
Right.
as Lithuania.
Right.
You haven't talked about them, and I'm wondering, both in context of your subject matter and more generally, why there seems to be a difference between those two countries and Lithuania.
Right. I'm going to answer your question.
I mean, are there fewer Jews in Latvia?
Yeah, that was one of my answers to your question. Clearly. So I want to answer your question, but I want to say that the kind of data that I presented here, right, which took like many years to gather, that I don't have that for Lithuania, right? Although one could do it. There was one election there. One could do it. I certainly don't have it for Estonia and Latvia. The main argument that's made, you just put your finger on, right? That there is the broad participation in the pogroms in Lithuania can largely be attributed to the fact that the Jews were an ethnically weighty demographic. What's more, and this you have to know something about Lithuanian politics. The Lithuanians initially treated the Jews very well after World War I. Why? Because they wanted Jewish political support for the areas that had been ceded to Poland. But once they realized they were not going to get that territory back, the Jews lost their usefulness to the Lithuanians. And there are a lot of them. You probably know that the Jewish population in Lithuania was as a percentage, among the most wiped out in all of Europe. I think the only one that's higher than that is the Dutch. I believe the Netherlands is even higher. Right? So I don't have the kind of explanation I'm giving you here. You could reproduce it, but life is short, and I did not have the resources, the linguistic. I learned Polish for this project. I grew up with Russian, but I learned Polish for this project, and that was enough. Lithuania would have done, but I couldn't have done. But somebody should do it, because I'll tell you why. There's a whole group of historians who deny that what I say happened in Western Belarus and Western Ukraine. They deny that it happened in Lithuania. And I've heard enough, and I've read enough to know that's not true. It did. It happened in a lot of places. It just hasn't been researched yet, right, in the kind of detail that I've done, right? And, people like Jared done, it's just completely rely upon this kind of very highly detailed, hour by hour, what happened in these places. That requires, there's a huge amount about the Holocaust we still don't know. But that's the level of detail, right? There's that line that I one time heard, it's a wonderful line, when the world's most record-obsessed people decided they were going to kill the world's most literate people, you were going to get a lot of writing about the subject. And it's true, there is a lot of writing about the subject, and we learn an awful lot. And I think one of the things I'm trying to do here as a political scientist is not simply to speak to the historians, who may like it or not like it, but actually to go back to the political scientists who study lynching, or violence in Africa, or Hindu-Muslim violence in India, and said, you can learn from us. You should study the Holocaust too. And if we don't do that, then the Holocaust is going to be a sort of a relic of education within a generation. Go ahead.
You've said it, that with new analyses and information in the last 6 years that some of your opinions have changed. Is there anything in the book that you wrote about that has changed since you've written it?
Yeah. At the very back of the book, we list every pogrom that we have, and we list the sources that we got it from. And that's basic issue of social science is replicability. You should be able to replicate our results, right? Political scientists are obsessed with that, and as well they should be. There are some things that we coded as pogroms where it appears the Germans were more involved, which would decrease, we could go from 219 to 216, 217, or whatever, and I'm willing to buy that completely. There are places that we have found where we did not know whether a pogrom happened or not, where we now know it did. So that would have added. Now, of course, you could say if that adds up over time and the political results are different in the various places, our results could change. Others are going to have to do that. There was one Polish historian who I quite admire his work. And he said, yeah, this is really easy what they've done. So, yeah. So easy, anybody could do this. I got to write a response to that review. Actually, they offered me a response. I said, he should go for it, right? Maybe he'll find the different results. And that's fine. That's what science is, right? Science is in the face of new results, whether you're going to the ethnographic, whether you're doing ethnographic work in the village, right? Or archival work in the town, right? You change your opinion you change your conclusions, right? That being said, that Zionist result, that's so strong. It's so strong that I'm confident we could lose 20% of our observations of our towns. We'd delete them, and it would still be statistically significant. There's no town or group of towns that are carrying the results, right? It's not skewed in that way, right? So of that, I'm fairly confident. And insofar as we made a contribution, we have spurred others to think more seriously. I want to say it this way. This is my general Holocaust point. The Holocaust happened in places. It stands to reason that the backstory of those places determined how it happened. So when Jared McBride is studying a place, it's funny, we had a great lunch and he talked about how he's moving back in time into the interwar period because you want to know the backstory of that place. It mattered a great deal. Where did these guys come from? What did they believe? And so I think, I think that's important. Did we miscode places? Yes, 100%. Sometimes, here's the problem. Sometimes in a place like Lvov, you have dozens of testimonies. You know definitely what happened there, right? There's no doubt. Other places, you have one or two. And the word pogrom is mentioned once. The Germans came in and spoke to the shopkeeper, and he organized a pogrom. So we code that as a pogrom. Okay? Now that's problematic. You ideally want better evidence than that. But these are not a class of events that easily yield their secrets. The locals don't want to tell you about it for the obvious reasons. Many of the Jews are dead. But it does account for a very interesting phenomenon. This is super interesting. The difference between, gets to the issue of a lot of Jews versus few Jews, the gentleman in the back asked. Why is it that the Jewish survivors disproportionately remember pogroms? I haven't written about this yet, but I want to. It's about the demographic determinants of memory. Jewish survivors disproportionately remember pogroms. Why? Because the pogroms happened where a lot of Jews lived. Poles and Ukrainians don't remember a lot of pogroms because in the vast majority of places they lived, there were very few Jews or no Jews. So you have this almost demographic determinant of the difference in memory culture, independent of whether the Ukrainians are simply trying to cover up their guilt, and independent of whether the Jews are simply trying to play up sympathy. Right? Independent of all of that, you have what appears to be this really neat demographic difference in memory. I'm not sure what to make of it. I'm sure my literature colleagues or history colleagues might have some idea.
Thank you so much. So if I understand your argument correctly, this is a story of polarization, of political affiliation,
Yes.
of political identity, and
Yes.
a clash of political projects, which I assume implies certain development of culture, of political consciousness,
Yeah.
of material infrastructure. So I wonder, can you expand a little on the correlation between pogrom and the difference between urbanized places and rural areas?
Right.
Is there any difference in those?
Yeah. Yes. The units that we're dealing with here are the community, right? Which in Poland is called the gmina, right? Which is sort of a, it's not a county, it's a township. It's a township. Sometimes cities are gmina unto themselves. The smallest unit of analysis that we have are places that have 500 people, the size of an American high school, where really everybody knew everybody, right? There's just no way of avoiding it. The Jews tended to know the Poles and Ukrainians. The Ukrainians and Poles didn't always know the Jews, which is what you would expect in a culture where you're a minority, right? Okay. So you have these different sizes of communities. One other sub-point I want to make is that, but those drawings of those communities, those boundaries, those are administratively made. So you can't make much of that, right? So you have, that's why if you look at there, that is Białystok and Policy. That's, 360 places, right? Then let's go to Galicia. There you have 1,800 places. But it's not like there were just more places. It had to do with the drawing of the map. They just made the townships bigger. Why? They did it for electoral reasons, because the Poles were trying to rig the elections. Okay. There's one other point I want to make here. What we call a shtetl. You've probably made this 1,000 times in this room, right? A shtetl, that is the Jewish town, the town where where trade went on. A shtetl refers to the thing that has killed all of Jewish understanding of what a shtetl is the film Fiddler on the Roof. Because that was not a shtetl. That was a village. A shtetl is the word for small city. Städtchen in German. It's a small city. And so it was in the shtetls, the Städtlach in Yiddish. It was in the Städtlach that you really had a lot of economic life. These were towns. What you saw in Fiddler on the Roof was not a town. So that was that's the second point B. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question. Because your question was about different kinds of communal size?
I'm just willing to understand if the rural communities where
Rural.
development of certain identities might be problematic are
Yes.
we're prone to
Yes.
like how do you participate like in line with your argument if yours doesn't have that concept?
Yes, so you had, the point is that the rural communities were all listening to the radio and getting press at this time. Historically, the pogroms had proceeded along the lines from the 1880s on in Russia and other places, had proceeded along the lines of railroads, right? Communication, right? But over time that changes and they go to smaller and smaller towns. And the reason you have smaller towns is they all join. I mean, my grandfather, who was born in a place called Novogrudek, Novarodok in Yiddish. The only other person besides me that's from there is Jared Kushner. His family's from there as well. It's the site of his grandmother actually got out one of the longest tunnel escapes. They joined the Bielski brothers. That's where the film Defiance, if you've ever seen it, that's where it was. My grandfather talked about they were 20 miles from the nearest railroad. You still can't take a railroad to Novogrudek. You have to take a marshrutka. You have to take one of these little minibuses to get there. But by the time of the 1930s, all of these places had been mobilized into public life. You had reading rooms. The Endetia had reading rooms. The Zionists had reading rooms, right? You had a local intelligentsia. Yeah, you had farmers in rural areas, but you also had, the Jews tended to live in towns, sometimes few, right? But many times an awful lot. We saw in Jedwabne, right? Let's look at Jedwabne. Oh, I skipped it. Oh, actually, I didn't give the absolute numbers there. That's a bummer. So, you know, Jedwabne is a town of about 3,000 people, right? Large American high school. It was, I mean, people have studied this place to death at this point, right? And it was, people were totally exposed to the world there. They were not cut off. So, of course, there was a different culture than in places like Lvov, right, or Warsaw, right? Those were metropolises, absolutely. But a lot of people listen to radio. There's good studies to be done on radio, and who listen to the radio. And you could actually do very interesting if you're statistically inclined, because radio didn't reach very far. So you could draw concentric circles around the town where radio signals were most likely or least likely to be heard. People have done that for Rwanda. I'm not making it up, right? The role of nationalist radio.
All right, let's thank Professor Kopstein for coming and thank all of you for coming.